Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Daniel, and today in this video we'll be continuing my coverage of my Scarborough Chess Championship games. So now we will be looking at my round 3 game. So as some of you may know, if you watched the first 2 rounds, I'm currently on 2 out of 2. I won my first 2 games, both of them with the black pieces. So this game I was rewarded with the white pieces. What wasn't a reward, however, was the opponent I had to play, which actually ended up being a 2245 National Master, CFC rated. And so let's take a look at what happened in this game. So as I mentioned, I'm playing the white pieces, so I open with the move d4. And my opponent here responds with knight f6. So as I know he has a very high rating, I more or less expected him to play something like the Nimzo Indian, because that's sort of what I expect with the move knight f6. And then I would have to try some new sort of things I learned in my repertoire. So for example, after c4, e6, this would more or less indicate the Nimzo Indian. It would truly indicate after knight c3 and bishop b4. This is the Nimzo Indian. Basically the point is it doesn't allow white to play e4 directly to gain space, as you would see in like a King's Indian defense, for example, because we're utilizing this pin against this knight to the king. So here there's just simply knight takes e4. You can't take because then the bishop would take the king. And then white has to contort a little bit to sort of get this move e4 on the board. It's something that's pretty common, but still, after bishop b4, I used to play the move queen c2. And after my opponent played knight f6, I was debating on this position whether I would play queen c2 or a move that I had more or less recently learned, which is the move bishop to g5. This is known as the Leningrad defense, Leningrad variation, of the Nimzo Indian defense. It's a little bit more, I won't say dubious, but it's a little bit more rarely seen, and I hadn't learned the full intricacies of it yet, so I wasn't sure what to go for necessarily. Thankfully, however, I avoided all of this because my opponent played the move g6. After c4, my opponent played the move g6 here, indicating that my opponent would either play one of 3 things. One would be some Benoni or Benko gambit with the move c5 later on, or they would play a move like d5, which would indicate a Grunfeld at some point, or they would play bishop g7 and castles and d6 and go for a King's Indian defense. Out of these 3 options, I was most confident if he went for the King's Indian defense. The other 2 options, I had sort of certain setups that I would go for. However, I wasn't too confident in both of them. I could obviously still play both of them, and they were both still playable, but I would be more happy to see a King's Indian defense. And thankfully, my wish was granted. So you'll see here knight c3, bishop g7, here e4, stopping this d5 or c5 ideas, because then I can play d5 or takes. Here d6, knight f3, castles, and here we get a King's Indian defense. Point is, white has this massive center. However, black contests it with the move e5, and then starts to try to attack on the king side, while white does so on the queen side. Here, bishop to e2, e5, d5, and now this sort of sets the point, kind of. You'll see this pawn structure here kind of splits the board in half diagonally in a sense. So whenever white castles king side, sort of this diagonal here will sort of split the board in half. Black will use his pieces to attack on this flank, basically on the king side, while white will try to use the queen side to sort of expand their space and also try to win on the queen side. So here a5, typically a common move, indicating like the Petrosian variation, basically indicating knight a6, knight to c5 to attack this e4 pawn with both these knights. And the reason why a5 is necessary before you play knight a6 is because a5 basically prevents the move b4 in all of these variations, where when the knight is on c5, there's simply a takes b4, sorry. So here castles, knight a6, bishop e3. Here I actually had a bit of a dilemma. Typically I go for the move bishop e3. However, now after the move bishop e3, there is this move knight g4, which gets a little bit wonky here, because after bishop g5, f6, here I typically play bishop h4. However, after something like knight h6, knight d7, queen e8, f3, and something like f5, this position is still playable. It transposes back into something I know. However, there are some cases where, let's say queen e8 earlier on is played, and after a move like knight d2, I was always concerned about something like f5 here, because I can't play f3 to consolidate, because simply knight d3 would fork my queen and my rook. And so I'd probably have to play something like bishop captures on g4, pawn takes, f3, pawn takes, rook takes, and queen takes. Funnily enough, this actually did occur in another game I played a while back, or something very similar to this. I do remember something like bishop takes g4 and playing the move like f3. This happened in a game where I played in, I believe, Cincinnati, I believe, or somewhere recently. I believe it might have been actually Boston, the Boston Chess Congress, where I actually ended up drawing a national master in this exact variation. So, funnily enough, this game I was playing a national master, that game I drew a national master, maybe there's some indication there. However, in this game, my opponent never played the move knight g4. Instead, they played the move bishop to d7. And instantly when I saw this move, I got very happy. Point being that I knew bishop d7, although it doesn't lose, I knew it was a bit inaccurate. And the reason why is because this bishop actually sits better on c8. Because with the bishop on d7, in some variations, it cuts off the defense of the queen to the d6 pawn. Obviously, in this variation, in this position, you can't really see that just yet. But there are scenarios where you play the move c5, play knight d2, knight to c4, targeting this d6 pawn, as well as knight b5 to target d6 as well, sometimes c7. And this bishop here on d7 is kind of in the way of everything. In fact, I've actually lost a game similar to this, also in the Boston Chess Congress, to a 2000 rated opponent, USCF. It was quite a grueling game. After bishop d7, everything kind of fell apart. However, here I noticed this bishop d7 move and tried to work with it. So knight to d2, angling for the c5 idea. However, I realized that later on you'll see that knight e1 might have been the smarter decision. Knight e8 here, a3, trying to maybe push b4 in some cases. f5 here, f3 is necessary. On f4, I have bishop f2. And here, bishop f6. This is actually a very interesting move. Point being that, actually I've never really seen this plan before in the King's Indian by my opponent. And in hindsight, now that I think about it, it's quite, well, it actually has some point. Firstly, it has a point to it, and secondly, I feel like it actually goes for more of a drawish variation than anything, because it trades off some of the most important pieces on the board. So the main point of bishop f6, I realized, is to play bishop to g5. And the point being is that when white tries to attack in the King's Indian defense, white's main catalyst to do so is with this bishop, with this dark square bishop, because you'll see this bishop when it sits on f2, it perfectly sort of supports the c5 advance after b4. It also supports b6 advances. It also supports these knights, and it complements them really well. And so this bishop is kind of the catalyst for white's attack. And the point with bishop f6 is to try to go bishop to g5 to trade off this bishop, because this bishop here for black on g7 doesn't really do much. For black, the catalyst, or the bishop that actually contributes in the attack, is the light square bishop. After a move like f4, you'll see this bishop gets opened up. And so black's bishop here on f6 or on g7 doesn't really do much for black, because it's all blocked in. So it's better if black can try to trade this bad bishop basically for white's good bishop, which is what black is angling for. Here I play the move b3. Here, in hindsight, I thought of the move like king h1 here. Now that I think about it, the point being is that if you play bishop g5, I just play bishop g1, and you don't get your favorable bishop exchange. However, I realize now that there is maybe some variation like bishop takes d2, queen takes d2, and a move like a4. The point of this is basically to clamp down on the queen side here and not allow white to play the move b4. However, there is this move is actually, or this variation in general, is not that great, mainly because of the dark square weaknesses that have been generated, as well as here the computer suggests a move like f4 to basically break open the king side and try basically for white to generate an attack on the king side instead. So instead here, I just play the move b3. My point was basically, I saw that variation after bishop g5 where bishop f2, then there's bishop takes d2, queen takes, and a move like a4 to clamp down on the queen side. So b3 just prevents this move a4, because on bishop g5, bishop f2, after takes, there is no longer a4 to clamp down on this b2, a3 structure. Instead, my pawn is now on b3, so if you play a4, I just play b4, and this accelerates my attack. In fact, it already claims that white is winning here. So instead, I play bishop f2, and my opponent plays bishop h4. And here I play the move queen b1. Better would have been to play the move g3, which I also considered. However, I thought after a move like f4 in the future, with like, let's say the bishop on f6 or bishop on e7, white's king gets a little bit weak, because this sort of structure also occurs when actually white actually makes an inaccuracy in an earlier in the opening if you play the king's in the defense. So to illustrate sort of my point, I'll go back really quickly to sort of demonstrate what this inaccuracy ends up being. So e5, d5, a5, bishop e3, knight a6, castles, knight c5, knight d2, and here let's say bishop d7. That variation with your pawn on f3 and g3 can occur here if you play f3 too early. And you play f3 too early when you realize the knight is still on f6, because now the knight has this square here on h5 to jump into the f4 square, whereas before there is no knight h5 because simply bishop captures on h5. And here after f3, knight h5, you have to prevent the knight from getting to the f4 square. Otherwise, it gets quite annoying as there is some knight d3 ideas. So sort of this pawn structure, which you saw earlier in the other variation, could also occur again. And I know here, black realistically has a very nice position. For me, myself, I really can't handle these that well. I've lost tons of game in online positions like this after a move like f5, f4, followed by queen h4 or something like this, and it gets really dubious for me and I can't really play these well, which is why I didn't actually end up going for this, because I saw something in a different variation which I didn't really prefer. So jumping ahead here back to this position, and which is why I played queen b1. I realized that these bishops can't really be, they can't really stop seeing each other basically, like they're going to be traded, point being that if I play bishop e3, f4 and I have to come back, and then I basically wasted a couple of moves there, which I actually also still considered, because after something like this, the queen no longer has influence over this knight, which you'll see in some other variations. But point being that here, that at least closes off the diagonal for the queen. Instead here, I played queen b1. My point is basically, I want to try to expand here on the queen side, generally like following my plan, because I realized that after bishop takes f2, rook takes, the point is to put your knight on c5 without having bishop takes c5. Here I realized I still have the move b4 nonetheless, pawn takes, pawn takes. And here I'm still attacking this knight gets kicked back, I still have this open file I can work with, and things of this nature. So I thought, okay, queen b1, that's fine. Black doesn't really have any like sort of progress that they can make. And so after rook takes f2, I also did realize that there's this move queen g5, which is what I mentioned with closing off the diagonal. If the pawn was already on f4, like in this case, let's say instead of queen b1, I play bishop here, f4, bishop back, bishop captures, rook takes. There is no queen g5 per se, because the queen is now cut off with this pawn here on f4. But I still prefer this variation with this pawn on f5, because I saw something else later on that we will show. So I play queen b1, bishop takes, rook takes, queen g5, targeting this knight, threatening to play queen to e3 to infiltrate into white's position. Knight f1, very simply covering the e3 square. Knight back to f6 here, putting pressure here on the e4 point. Here I play queen to c1. In my opinion, a critical move, not the best move in the computer's eyes, but sort of my point with this is that I realized the pressure here on this e4 pawn is something I can't really deal with well with the queens on the board. Because I saw this sample variation where, let's say I play a move like a4, just a random move, then here white is already losing because of a move like f takes e4. After something like, let's say, pawn takes e4, then very simply here, there's variations like knight g4, or something of the sort, moving the knight out of the way, where after rook takes f2, king takes f2, the king is wide open. And after something like rook f8, this queen, this knight, this bishop, and this rook will all team up against white's king, whereas my pieces are still stuck on the queen side. So it's very important I don't go for something like this, and which is why I thought queen c1 was very important, because if I trade off the queens, then there's no way for black to actually attack me. And I saw that in those positions, after rook takes f2 and king takes f2, I'm very happy to just simply put my king on e3. There's no critical checks, there's no queens on the board especially, and my king is really safe. And here queen takes c1 is the best move, which my opponent did play. If they played something else like queen h4, I prepared the move f4 here, opening up this discovery and threatening to like take something in the middle and open up and clarify the situation. So queen takes c1, rook takes, pawn takes, and here knight g4. Here I saw this position all the way back when I played queen c1. However, I wasn't really sure how to react to it. I thought after knight g4, I'd originally considered rook takes f8, rook takes f8, and something like h3. If they hop in with the knight, then after something like bishop to f3, I thought my position would be good. However, here I realized that there is knight takes h3, showing that this pawn is overloaded in its defense, and after pawn takes and rook takes f3, white is completely losing here. Everything is getting attacked, everything is falling apart. So instead, however, I decided rook takes f8, bishop takes g4. I didn't want to go for this because practically there are some issues with this move, bishop takes g4. There are obviously, from an objective point of view, there is nothing objectively wrong. Computer claims it's completely equal after bishop takes g4. However, there was the slight worry in my head that since all of my pawns were on light squares, this light square bishop could maybe target them in the future. Thankfully, I realized my position was solid enough. There's no way for black's bishop to actually infiltrate. Black actually tries to do that, but to no avail later on. And so here I just simply play h3. There's no squares here for the bishop to converge into white's position. Bishop d7, and here knight d2, what I find is a very critical move. Point being of knight d2 is that it just glues all of white's weak points together. The knight on d2 supports b3 and e4, and more importantly, the knight on d2 is on a dark square, so this bishop can't never target it. And here my point is I'm going to play rook f1 next, and then trade off the rooks and basically go into an equal endgame and try to see if I can do anything there. Knight to c5, trying to attack both, and which is why knight d2 is very critical. Rook f1, and here rook f4. And here I thought for a very long time. I was down to around 15 minutes here, but I wanted to calculate a specific variation, which might be down to like around 6 or 7 minutes. The reason why I thought for a long time here is because I originally planned the move knight to e2. Basically asking this rook a question of where it wants to go. If it goes back, then obviously I just trade the rooks, king f2, king e3, and I'm very happy there. However, here I saw this very interesting variation with the move knight takes e4. Point being is you're sacrificing the exchange, however you do get 2 pawns in return, as well as a passed pawn here. And after a move like knight d3, you can play something like h5, you can play something like king f7, and basically you just have 2 extra pawns as black for the exchange. And I thought that in the endgame scenario, it might be more dangerous that my opponent has 2 extra pawns than my extra exchange, because obviously in the endgames, the point is to try to get a queen, and if you have 2 extra pawns than white, then you have more pawns or more opportunities to get a queen, whereas my rook, it can't magically turn into a queen. So which is why I got a big concern of this variation. However, I realized, well, I don't really have any other good moves besides from that. Rook f3 is the other move I considered. I did not like this after knight takes, because then there's knight takes b3, and if not, then after pawn takes, there's bishop takes h3. So I'm like, okay, well, I don't have any other choice, so knight e2. And I evaluated the position after knight takes e4 with rook takes f4 or knight takes f4. I realized it's probably around equal. I should be okay. So I went for it. Fortune favors the bold, obviously. And thankfully, my opponent here blitzed out the move rook takes on f1. Thankfully, they blitzed this out. I was very relieved. I just simply played king takes. b5 here, trying to open up this diagonal for the bishop to infiltrate. However, I'm quick enough with king f2. Pawn takes, bishop, king f7, and here I play king e3. And now all of these pawns in the center of the board are glued together by my 2 knights. These 2 knights restrict sort of a lot of squares from the bishop from being able to infiltrate, sort of. And here my opponent tries bishop a4. I play knight c3, attacking this bishop. And here I realize I should be able to hold a draw even with low time. Knight b5 to attack c7, and here I realized my opponent's plan, trying to sort of reroute the king all the way around to get to the c5 square and trying to win the c4 pawn. However, I realized that right now, and I was able to generate counterplay on the king side so that the king was it was distracted between both sides of the board and could never achieve this long-term plan. So here knight f3, here h6 was played. I play knight h4, targeting this g5 pawn. If you play g5, then I simply have knight f5 check, winning this h6 pawn, and then maybe white even has some chances to win this game. So here, best move is king f6, which makes sense. And now the king is 1 step farther away from getting to the c5 square. So satisfied, I've come back with the knight to f3, because with my knight on f3, I can always play knight e2 to defend the c4 pawn in case of the move bishop to b3. Here, bishop to d1. I don't want to trade because I don't know what are the practical chances there. Maybe the knight can sneak in somehow. I don't like that. So here, king e7. I play knight back to c3, kicking this bishop away. This bishop can't go to h5 because then it gets trapped with the move g4, and now white is completely winning. So it has to stay on this diagonal. It goes to c2, and now I come back with knight f3. My point is, again, to go back to h4 and annoy black's king so that black's king can never achieve their plan. Here, knight c5. Knight h4 going after the g6 pawn, king back to f6, knight back to f3 to prevent bishop b3. Here bishop b3, knight e2, bishop to c2, and here I play knight b5. This knight is back on c5, so I'm going back to target the c7 pawn. Basically, white is just playing a game of tickle until black either concedes something or it's just going to be a draw. Here knight a6, and here I play knight f3, just another waiting move. Bishop to a4, knight back to c3, and after bishop b3 and knight to d2, here we actually agreed to a draw, meaning that I was able to draw a National Master in my round 3 game, meaning I moved to 2.5 out of 3, and I'm tied for second in the standings. So, quite a complicated game. I will say I'm very happy with how I played, because after I went home and analyzed, I realized that my performance rating was 2750, near 2800, because the computer was sort of balancing between those two numbers there, meaning that I played this game as if I was a 2750 player. And so very happy with the result. Obviously, drawing a national master isn't something that happens every day. And very happy with this. Quite a tense game throughout, very strategically heavy, positionally very heavy, and things of that nature. So yeah, so hope you guys all enjoyed this recap, and I'll see you guys next week for the round 4 recap of my Scarborough Chess Championships.